Miles of Track, 55, Years on Britain's Rails. Part 1, Apprentice of the Rail, The Early Days, 1970s Youth, Training, and the Freight Years, Chapter 1. Signal and Start. The uniform didn't fit. The sleeves were too long. The trousers flapped like ship sails. And the cap, well, the cap made me look like a choir boy pretending to be a copper. But none of that mattered, because I was 17, and I was on the railway. It was March 1970. Cold, grey, and damp, in that peculiar way the Midlands always manages to be, no matter the forecast. Wolverhampton Station smelled of damp concrete, cigarettes, and oil. I remember standing on the platform that first morning, boots still shiny, hands shaking slightly inside borrowed gloves, watching a Class 47 rumble through with a kind of slow, juddering majesty that made the platform tremble underfoot. It was the closest thing I'd ever felt to awe. I'd applied for the job on a whim, really. Dad worked in a shoe factory. Mum cleaned for the co-op. No one in our family had ever worn a uniform that wasn't made of apron or overalls. But trains, they felt different. Solid, important, romantic even, if you squinted past the rust. The depot foreman that day was a man called Cyril, wide as a wardrobe and just as wooden. He barked everything like he was still in the war. "Ellis, you're late. Clock in. Stop gawping." I hadn't spoken yet. That first day, I was handed over to a fire-eyed, red-nosed driver named Len, who had spent the previous 37 years in a haze of diesel fumes and boiled sweets. He looked me up and down and said, "Christ, you'll get eaten alive." Then he handed me a battered flask and said, "Tea, no sugar, you'll learn." I was to be a traction trainee, starting on freight runs out of Oxley. My job, to begin with, was mostly to keep out of the way. Watch, learn, fetch, sweep, make tea, stay awake, don't die. The locomotives were brutal, hulking beasts, Class 20s and 25s that roared like angry dogs and smelled of steel, oil, and the ghost of coal. I'd never known such noise, or such silence either. Some nights, waiting in sidings, the only sound was the click of cooling metal and the far-off bark of a fox. I learned quickly that railways weren't always movement. They were stillness, anticipation, patience, like a hunter crouching in the reeds. Len taught me more than any manual ever could. "Don't trust a quiet signal box," he'd say. "If a bloke's too friendly, he's either nicked something or about to." He showed me how to listen for the wrong sort of rattle, to smell a brake before it burned, and to always check the second set of lights yourself. People lie, signals don't. We worked long hours. Back then, no digital clocks or ergonomic dashboards. Just leather seats worn smooth by ghosts, dials that juddered, and levers that fought back. But there was pride in it, a kind of monk-like satisfaction in doing a job well and not saying much about it. I remember one particular shift, my third week on the job. We were on a night freight run down to Birmingham, carrying steel coils that clanged ominously every time we took a bend. It was freezing, and I was too green to know that the heater in the cab had to be kicked just so to work. Len just laughed when I asked. "Consider it a baptism," he said, through a mouthful of mint imperials. At about 2:15 a.m., something odd happened. We passed a signal that should have been green. It was yellow, just a warning. But it didn't sit right with Len. "Something's off," he muttered, pulling the throttle back with the same ease other men open kettles. We coasted for a good mile, and sure enough, around the next bend, a broken-down goods train stalled halfway onto the line. If we'd carried on at full throttle, we'd have been a footnote in some dusty accident report. I didn't say anything at the time, just sat there, heart hammering, watching frost crystals form on the inside of the cab window. But I realized then, this wasn't just a job. It was trust, and timing, and instinct. It was life and death, and tea breaks in between. Later that morning, after we'd offloaded, Len took us to a little cafe near New Street where all the old drivers went. He told the story like a joke, big hand gestures, wrinkled grins, embellishing the danger until it sounded like a war story. I just sat there, listening, basking in the warmth of eggs, bacon, and not being dead. No one made a fuss. No medals. No commendation. But the next time I turned up for shift, the older drivers nodded at me in that quiet way railwaymen do. A small nod. Enough. It's funny, looking back, how unprepared I was. My hands were soft, my boots too clean. I didn't even know how to read a full schedule card properly, but something clicked. Maybe it was the rhythm, the sacred tap-tap of wheels on track. Or maybe it was the people, the way they carried themselves like priests of some forgotten industrial religion. Or maybe I just liked the quiet, dependable certainty of a world where green meant go and red meant stop. All I know is I never looked back. I went home that day with grease in my hair, oil on my fingers, and a grin I couldn't wipe off. Mum said I smelled like a burned kettle, but Dad just smiled, handed me his old watch and said, "You'll need to know the time from now on." He was right, and I've been checking the time on the dot ever since. Chapter 2. The Freight Yard Baptism. They don't tell you that your first proper railway job might involve stepping into something warm, slick, and definitely not rainwater. The freight yard at Oxley was no cathedral. It was more like a battlefield of rusted giants. Rows of wagons lined up like old soldiers, chipped paint, scuffed buffers, axles caked with grime. The air always seemed to hang heavy with the mingled scent of diesel, metal, and whatever had leaked from the livestock wagons last week. I arrived just after dawn, barely having slept. The night before, I'd ironed my shirt with such care, Mum thought I had a date. Instead, I met Bob Pritchard, my first yard foreman, a man shaped like a sack of potatoes and twice as likely to bruise. He squinted at me through yellowed eyes and said, "You Stan, you'll do." That was the only welcome I got. Bob introduced me to my driver for the week, Tommy No Teeth Rhodes, not a nickname I gave him. It was painted on his locker door. Tommy was in his 50s, looked 70, and moved like he had nowhere to be and all day to get there. He'd once been second to passenger lines, but had too much of the docks in him, someone whispered. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I learned fast that freight drivers were a different breed. We were to assist on a mixed consist job, steel, timber, and fertilizer, crawling from Wolverhampton to somewhere near Walsall. It was the kind of journey that took hours to cover miles. "We're not the heroes," Tommy said with a grin as he threw his bag into the cab. "We're the slugs that keep the heroes fed." The loco that morning was a Class 25, tough as boots and about as comfortable. Climbing into the cab was like entering a world that had once been modern but had long since given up pretending. The heater didn't work. The windows were streaked with the fingerprints of past lives, and every surface felt faintly sticky. Tommy, naturally, lit a cigarette within 30 seconds. He let me throttle us up the first time. I'd never touched the control before. My hand trembled as I pushed it gently forward, feeling the engine respond. Growl first, then grumble, then finally, reluctantly, move. "Bit more than that, lad," he muttered. "You're not seducing it." We inched through the yard, brake squeals and coupling clanks echoing like some ancient metallic language. My job was simple: assist coupling, walk ahead, at junctions with the hand lamp, and most importantly, don't bloody fall under. It was during one of those coupling moments I had my first baptism. A wagon leaking God knows what had pooled a slick puddle just beneath the coupling I had to secure. One foot slipped, the other tried to compensate, and before I knew it, I was lying flat on my back in cold muck, staring up at a seagull perched on a signal arm, like it was judging my life choices. Tommy just shook his head when I climbed back up, brown with filth and prideless. "You've been freighted, son. You're one of us now." By mid-morning, we were crawling along branch lines, past rows of terraced houses where curtains twitched as we passed. I'd never known a train could move so slowly. Kids would run alongside us for fun. A dog chased us for 3 stops. An elderly woman waved at every crossing like she was the queen. I waved back. It felt like the right thing to do. There was a stop near Bilston where we waited 47 minutes for a clear signal. Tommy used the time to explain the unofficial freight driver's code. Rule 1, never trust the shunter. Rule 2, always carry your own mug. Rule 3, if a sandwich looks suspicious, it is. Rule 4, a late train's better than a derailed one. Rule 5, sleep when you can. Complain when you must. Laugh when it's safe. By lunch, I'd burned my tongue on tea, bruised my shin on a brake pipe, and nearly dropped a crowbar on my own foot. I loved every second of it. Tommy took us to a siding where we waited for a pass-through. There, amid the weeds and pigeon droppings, we shared sandwiches and stories. He told me about his first shift in 1956. "Fog so thick you could shave it," he said. Back then, we didn't have radios. Just instinct and the fear of dying cold. He looked out the window, eyes narrowing at a passing pigeon, and said something I never forgot. "Freight's thankless. No one cheers when you get there. But without it, Britain stops breathing. Just remember that." As the sun began to sink, we finally completed our run. We rolled into a minor depot, no announcement, no applause. Just a clipboard handed to me by a bored-looking clerk and the thunk of the engine winding down. I rode back to Oxley in silence, the vibrations still in my legs, my arms sore from climbing, my hair matted with dust. Tommy looked over at me and gave the faintest nod. "You did all right." It was the first praise I'd had all day. When I got home, Mum opened the door and recoiled. "You smell like a barn," she said. "Good," I replied. That night, as I lay in bed, aching, filthy, full of sausage rolls and secondhand smoke, I thought about what Tommy had said, about no one cheering, about the trains that slithered through the backbones of cities while the country slept. Freight wasn't glamour. It wasn't speed or fame. It was sweat and grime and slow progress in the right direction. It was work, and I'd just begun mine. Chapter 3. Diesel in my blood. There's a smell you never forget. Diesel, hot oil, scorched brake dust, and the faint tang of metal fatigue. Some hated it. I drank it in like it was oxygen. The Class 37 had that smell in spades. By 1972, I had graduated from trailing behind other men with a lantern to being given proper time inside the cab. Not just to watch, but to know. The Class 37 was my first love, in a way. A loud, stubborn, clattering brute with a voice like thunder and a personality all her own. I remember the first time I rode in her cab alone. No driver, just me and the ticking of the cooling engine on a layover in Stafford Yard. The loco idled like a dozing beast, thick-bodied and breathing through grills the size of a butcher's door. Even powered down, she gave off a low vibration, like she was never entirely at rest. They called her Growler, which fit. When she moved, she didn't so much roll as snarl. The older drivers treated the 37s with a wary respect. "She'll bite if you're careless," one told me, as he stubbed out a woodbine on the cab wall. "Mind the gears. Don't trust the amateur. And if you hear anything that sounds like applause, that's probably your traction motor exploding." I took notes, always did. But more than that, I listened. I wanted to understand her voice, every rattle, cough, and shudder. There was a rhythm to it, like learning a song by ear. One driver, Kev, had a theory. Every loco's got a heartbeat. Learn it, trust it. It'll tell you when something's off, before your gauges do. So I did. At first, I'd stand on the side step as she rolled into depots and listen, eyes closed, boots balanced, absorbing the pitch and pulse of her engine note. Later, I'd sit in the second man's seat and gently rest my hand on the control desk, feeling the subtle hum through my fingertips. There was a day in Doncaster when I swore I could feel something out of time, just a slight lurch on the right bank. The driver thought I was daft. "You trying to romance her, Ellis?" He laughed. But 2 days later, that same unit failed inspection. Cracked suspension spring. Not visible, but I felt it. From then on, they stopped teasing me so much. Driving her was something else. That wide cab view, the lurch and pull of her power notch when you eased her up past 20 ampere. It wasn't smooth like the newer units. She fought back, made you earn the motion. The throttle had weight to it, physical resistance that built muscle memory in your palm. She taught you patience, guts, foresight. She forced you to think 5 moves ahead. Accelerate too hard, and your load jumped. Brake too soft, and you'd overshoot by 20 yards. One snowy afternoon outside Chesterfield, I remember edging her through a shallow bank of fog. Visibility was rubbish. The route ahead dipped under a bridge where the frost liked to collect. She started to wheel spin, axle tremble and all. I backed off gently, feathering the throttle, trying not to panic. She regained grip, rolled forward, steady, as if saying, "All right, lad, just don't rush me." After that shift, the driver said, "You talk to her like a woman." "No," I replied, "like a dog." He laughed. "What kind of dog growls, bites, and weighs 100 tons? The kind that gets you home." I began to love the routine. Pre-checks at dawn, crawling underneath with a torch, inspecting pipes, testing sanders, cleaning grime from the gauges with my sleeve, knowing every dial, every toggle, every hiss that should or shouldn't be there. There was a romance to it, not the sort with rose petals and poetry, but the kind forged in steel and spanners. At home, my hands always smelled of engine oil, no matter how much soap I used. I once ruined the carpet with a pair of socks that had absorbed something from my boots. Mum was furious. Dad just said, "Sign of honest work, that." It was during these years I started dreaming in motion. I'd wake up thinking I'd overshot a signal or feel the phantom rumble of the tracks beneath me even while lying in bed. On my days off, I'd still hear her low growl in the back of my brain. They say some men have salt in their blood. I had diesel. The 37 wasn't glamorous. She wasn't fast, but she was honest. You knew where you stood. When she failed, it was dramatic. Screams of metal, clouds of smoke, warning lights like disco strobes. But mostly, she ran, year in, year out, with only the quiet grumble of wear and the occasional belch to remind you she wasn't invincible. I still see her sometimes, preserved units at heritage railways, paint polished, running light just for show. Families pose in front of her, kids unaware of the miles she's seen. But I remember. I know what she sounds like under load, what she feels like just before she stalls, what her body language says when the load's too heavy or the curve too tight. There's a small photo of one on my mantelpiece, D6724, my favorite. We spent 8 months together on a Midlands freight rotation. No major breakdowns. Just hundreds of quiet, perfect shifts. Sometimes, when the grandkids visit, they ask why I never had a car. Because I already drove the best machine on wheels, I tell them. And I meant it.